welcome to tonight's Waterway and Catchment Report Card event, which is our Manning River. My name is Erin Masters and I'm an Environmental Engagement Officer here at Mid Coast Council, and I'd just like to thank you all for joining us this evening. So I guess I just want to start by acknowledging just how important the Mid Coast waterways are. They really are some of the most important parts of our landscape, and keeping them healthy keeps our communities thriving. They're important for wildlife, they're important for the health and activities that we undertake in them. They're a really important part of our environment. And so to achieve the best outcomes for our waterways, we rely heavily on things like research, monitoring, modelling and local knowledge to help us manage our waterways. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening, but we're going to talk about it particularly in regards to the Manning catchment. The Manning catchment obviously is one of the largest in the Mid Coast area, and you do have to remember that the Mid Coast area, for those that maybe don't know, is the same size as Jamaica. So we have a pretty large area, and the Manning catchment is one of the largest catchments in our area. We've had a few different research projects that have been taking place in the Manning catchment. We're also currently working on the Manning Catchment Management Program, and we're going to talk about that as well as the mapping of coastal wetlands and some different information about the effects of acid sulfate soils this evening as well. So first of all, just before we jump into our presentations, I would like to introduce you to our guests for this evening who are going to be presenting for us. We have Louise Duff, who works with Mid Coast Council.
Hi everyone.
And we also have Martin Sullivan and Bill Gladmore joining us this evening as well.
Hi guys.
Okay, so thanks for joining us everyone. Before we get started, the reason that we're here this evening is because we have just released our annual report card program. So the report card is our annual checkup of all of our waterways, the health of our waterways and how they're faring. So this is the front cover of our 2020 Waterway and Catchment Report Card. It is available on our website, or if you would like a hard copy of it, you can also give us send us an email at environment@midcoast.newsouthwales.gov.au. I'll pop that into the chat later on so that you can email it if you would like a hard copy. So each year we have independent scientists from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment who come in to check on the health of our waterways, and they use a couple of different indicators to do this. So first of all, we're looking at chlorophyll A, which is the way that algae grows in our waterways. We're also looking at the turbidity, which is how clear our waterways are, and we also monitor our seagrasses. And so we chose those indicators because they are a really clear indicator of ecological health in our waterways. So just here on the screen, you can see in a high conservation area or an area that's very healthy, we have very little algae, very clear turbidity and lots of healthy seagrass. As we go into a moderately disturbed environment, that turbidity is less and we have a bit more algae and less growth of seagrass, and in a heavily impacted, lots of algae and very high turbidity. So just to give you an idea, I think that everybody that lives in the Mid Coast area knows what a tough couple of years we've had. We've had a very extended period of drought, which really affects our waterways. It affects the ability of vegetation to grow along our catchment areas, and that really brings down the ability of holding in runoff from into our catchment when it does rain. We did also have some very extreme bushfires through our area this year. And then of course we had flooding conditions. So three of the biggest climatic events that you can have all followed in quick succession. So to give you an idea just of the rainfall that we had this year, you can see that in October through to January, there was very little rainfall, followed by flooding rains in February and still high rains in March as well. And to put that into perspective, we sampled 6 times during the period between 2019 and 2020. So just here in the orange bars, you can see are our sampling periods, and the blue bars are the rain in between. So you can see for the first 3 samples, we had those heavy drought conditions, not a lot of runoff. But in that time, we also had November, December and January, we also had the fires. So we had two samples that were during bushfire conditions. And then we had those moderate rains in January and flooding rains through February, which then affected our last couple of samples. Now, the other thing that does affect our results is the river versus lake estuary. So when we're talking about it in relation to the Manning is a river estuary. It's long and linear with a very large catchment area and a large tidal range. And the speed of the water flow when it rains, it can get very high as well. That's a little different to a lake estuaries, which are wide and shallow. So we're really looking at the Manning here. And you can see under low rainfall conditions in both a river estuary and a lake estuary, very low flow, very low algal levels. And in fact, under these conditions, the material that's already in the waterway is what will drive the results. That's different under moderate rainfall, where you're going to have high algae levels in both areas because of what's called residence time. And that's the amount of time that the water stays in the estuaries and allows that algae to grow. But what is interesting, and the reason that I'm showing you this, is because high rainfall events can have a very different effect in the waterways between a lake estuary and a river estuary. And in terms of the Manning, this is what we saw happening during those flooding conditions in February. And that is that the flood flow was so high and the water was moving so quickly through the system that we found that there was low algal levels because they were actually washed out before they could grow. And that's very different to in a lake estuary. So let's quickly have a look at the results for 2020. So each of our estuaries is given a result between A and F, much like a school report card. And this year we saw a drop in result for about half of our sites. So 9 sites dropped a grade and the other 9 stayed the same as they were last year. Now that's not really unexpected considering the conditions that we had. And in fact, the fact that no sites dropped more than 1 grade is quite impressive given that drought, bushfire, flood component. The Manning results are up the top here. And we'll just go through those quickly. So we have 5 sites in the Manning catchment. You've got, now remembering that these are all in the estuary, so it's further down, but we've got the 5 sites, so we've got the upper, mid and lower estuary, and then we also have the Dawson River estuary and Farquhar Inlet. So 2020 saw a continuation of the good grade in a couple of those areas, so that's a B grade in Farquhar, the lower Manning and the mid Manning. But we did drop a grade in both the upper Manning and the Dawson River estuaries. Dawson's River, the grade in Dawson River was interesting because it was really driven by algae, and you can see that here, that the black line is the algae for this year compared to last year. So you can see that that algae level was quite high, and that was what was really driving the results there in the Dawson River, although water clarity was also not so great. And the algae levels in the mid-Manning, same thing, a little bit higher than last year. And a lot of these results could have been affected by the fire, but we don't know that because of that flooding condition that happened straight afterwards. It's really hard to uncombine those, that's not really a word, but you know, to pull those results apart from one another. That interesting result between the bushfire immediately followed by flood just meant that those flooding conditions were washing all of that fire debris into the water, which does have an effect, but it could also mean that it was just that flood condition as we would expect in a flooding condition anyway. Farquhar Inlet retained its good grade, and we don't know how the effect of the opening the entrance was actually affected, just because it happened at the same time as those flood conditions. So again, those results are hard to untangle from one another. So overall, we also saw no growth of seagrass in the upper Manning estuary, and we saw a drop in the level of seagrasses in the mid Manning, and an increase in the lower Manning as well. So interesting seagrass results there as well, which are obviously affected by things like tidal flow as well. So that's a really quick overview. There is some more information out there. So we have the full document, which looks like this. And as I said, if you would like a hard copy, I can get you one of those. Just let me know and we'll send it out in the mail. It gives you a breakdown of all of the different results in all of the different areas, and also a little bit of information on how we use the research of the monitoring, modelling and management in order to look after our waterways. And we also have this document which talks about how do bushfires and floods affect waterways. So there's some interesting information on there, as well as some diagrams on the back that show how bushfires actually affect the waterways as well. So if you'd like a copy of either of those, you can either look at our Mid-Coast website, you just go and search report card, otherwise you can also email me and I'll send you a hard copy. All right, just quickly before I wrap that up, did anybody have any questions about any of that? Some of you may have heard it last week. I know that some of you came to our report card launch, which was great. Thank you for joining us. And for those that didn't, that's just a quick run through of the Manning results before we talk a little bit more about how the Manning River works and some of the research that we've been undertaking in the area this evening. Okay, so John's just asked, do we have comparative data for the Manning Estuary with Farquhar Inlet opened and closed? So we do actually take these results each year. Farquhar Inlet was only added in 2019 to as one of the sites that we were monitoring, but it was closed in 2019. So it does give a little bit of an indication of the differences between open and closed. But obviously now that we have that site being done each year, it will provide some baseline data for exactly what you're asking there, John, to see what happens when it's open versus when it's closed. We do have results for the rest of the Manning, the upper, mid and lower have all been being tested since 2014. So we would be able to look at those and see the differences between open and closed as well, because we have information on when the outlet is open and closed. But it's not something that we've looked at this time yet. So I'd like to introduce Louise Duff, who is the Catchment Management Coordinator for Mid-Coast Council. Would you like to join us, Louise? Hi. So Louise has been working with us for the last several years. She's leading work on the catchment management program, working with a lot of our community stakeholders, developing this new program for the Manning, and that's a little bit what she's going to talk about tonight. So I'll hand over to you, Louise.
Right, well, as Erin introduced me, I'm the catchment coordinator, and our team's role is to look after water quality and ecosystem health in the Manning River and the estuary, as well as all the other catchments in this region. So to help us do that, we are preparing the Manning River Estuary Catchment Management Program at the moment, working with a lot of community people and stakeholders and academics and technical people. We're taking a whole of catchment approach to the plan, and we're using science to underpin it. So I'm going to show you one of the pieces of work that's been done for us by Dr. Rebecca Swanson from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and it's a estuary health risk model. So the reason we're preparing a catchment program is because this is our community's vision for the river. We want to have beautiful, healthy water. We want to be able to go fishing and catch fish. We want to go swimming and have our kids playing in the river with really good water quality for that. And of course, beautiful riparian vegetation that is, hosts wildlife and looks after water quality. And what we don't want is this. So you can see compacted, cleared soil. You can see algae in the left from nutrients, cattle in the river. The top right is a plume from acid sulfate soil. We have a fish kill from a black water event and weeds growing in the riparian veg. So the purpose of doing this plan that we're preparing is to help us, work with all of our partners to best manage the river for that beautiful, healthy vision that you saw in the last slide. Now, why do we need a risk model? Well, the Manning catchment is huge. As Erin said, it covers almost 8,500 kilometres square, right from Gloucester Tops and Barrington Tops down to the coast. To manage this catchment, we need to know what's the problem, where is the problem, and how do we invest to achieve the best outcomes. So the estuary health risk model really started when we first looked at the New South Wales Marine Estate Threat and Risk Assessment. So this risk assessment was done by state government, and it covers the estuaries and marine waters of the whole coast, as well as the northern region. And the outcome from their process was a set of risks with the ratings. We then looked at them more closely for the Manning with our technical working group, and you can see the sort of things that we came up with for the Manning. So we've got urban stormwater, pest and disease, vegetation clearing, sewage and effluent runoff. But the two we were really interested in that are the subject of this presentation and our estuary health risk model were agricultural impacts, particularly diffuse source runoff and stock in riparian vegetation. We looked at what our knowledge gaps were for the manning, and we really didn't have as much information as we needed about these two impacts and where and how we were best to manage them. So as we said, we commissioned Rebecca Swanson to prepare the estuary health risk model, and this looked at inputs from land use on water quality in the estuary, and in particular it looks at nutrients, so total nitrogen and total phosphorus, as well as sediments in the form of total suspended solids. Now there's a lot of other science that's being done to underpin the plan, and you'll hear more about that from Will and Martin, but this is just in particular the estuary health risk model. So the estuary health risk model is made up of all these layers, and it's like a layer cake, if you like, and the layers are spatial, they're derived from data, and then they're combined into the final model. So these layers represent likelihood and consequence. So any risk assessment, if you've ever done, say, work health safety risk assessment or business risk assessment, you look at the likelihood of a pressure having an impact and then the consequence, and that's exactly what's been done with this model. So in likelihood, the model looks at surface flow of water, sediment and nutrients, as I've said, and also proximity to the estuary. And then in terms of consequence, it uses a hydrodynamic model. So this is a bit what Erin's actually just showed you, the differences between the river and the lake estuaries. It shows us the way water moves through the estuary, how long it is retained in the estuary, and therefore the sensitivity of the estuary to different subcatchments as they shed their surface flow carrying the pollutants. So now let's just have a look at some of those layers. Clearly surface flow has a major influence on agricultural runoff. So this is the amount of rain that falls and the way it flows then into the waterway. The dark blue high flow areas relate to headwaters in the mountains with high rainfall and steep slopes. And you can also get high flows where there's been land modification. So if there's clearing, stock, poor compact soil with low organics, you're going to get water running off much faster there as well. And we're hearing anecdotes from the farmers that, you know, you used to have 3 days to get your pump out of the river. If it rained in Gloucester Tops and you lived in Mount George, you know, you had plenty of time to get your pumps out so they weren't damaged. And now it's 24 hours because that runoff is just accelerated over the decades. The next layer that the model looks at is erosion and sediment. So sediment comes from a range of sources, but this model in particular, as I said, focuses on agriculture. So you get cattle pugging of the banks, cattle tracking up and down the hills, causing a range of different types of erosion. And then you can see on the right the high turbidity. That was actually the January rain that Erin was talking about, and it was after the fire. So you can see the really high level of sediment. We obviously lost a lot of vegetation cover during that fire, and that's also led significantly to that high turbidity. So why are we interested in sediment? Well, sediment in the river reduces light in the water column. It clogs the gills of fish and aquatic invertebrates, and it smothers habitat. So the sort of cobbles and rocks in the bottom of the creeks and rivers that are important habitat for water bugs and things like that at the base of the food chain. The sediment can also fill up refuge pools, and it mobilises nutrients. So this is the layer in the estuary health risk model that comes from data, and it's on the generation rate of sediment. The generation rate for sediment is expressed as kilograms per hectare per year. And the generation rate comes from the land use class. So whether it's grazing modified pasture, native pasture, irrigated pasture, it's going to generate more sediment. Each subcatchment in the manning is assigned a land use class, and the pollutant loads in surface flow runoff are predicted for each of these land use classes. So we use generation rate rather than total load because it's seen as a better method in terms of predicting where the biggest issues are going to be. And you can see the generation rates for the Manning here. The subcatchments with the highest generation rates are the estuary itself in that really dark brown, as well as the lower Gloucester River. And then in the northeast, we've got the Lansdowne, Dingo Creek, Cedar Party Creek and Cat Eye Creek. Next, the model considers nutrients. So nutrients are caused by things like fertiliser in the paddock you can see in the top left, cattle defecating and manure that's then washed into the water in those rain events. And it causes excess algae, and you can clearly see that in the right, which that photo was taken on a rapid assessment exercise we did in August. And it also leads to fish kills, and that photo of the fish kill there was taken in January. We didn't have a lot of fish kill, luckily, in the Manning compared to Kempsey, but we still did have a bit. So what's the problem with nutrients? Nutrients stimulate algae growth, and then when you get that big algae bloom, as it dies off, the bacteria decompose the dead algae. As it does that, the bacteria consumes oxygen and deoxygenates the water, and then the fish and the aquatic fauna suffer. Excess algae also blocks light from the water column as well, so that causes die-off of submerged plants as well. So this is the map of nutrient generation rates. This one in particular is total nitrogen, but our risk report also shows phosphorus. And you can see here the highest risks are again in that same northeast, Lansdowne, Dingo Creek, Cedar Party Creek and Cat Eye, as well as the lower Manning estuary and upper Manning. So quite a similar picture to the sediment map. The model also takes into account proximity. So its focus is estuary health. That's because we're preparing this plan under the Coastal Management Act and the Marine Estate Management Act. So although we are taking a whole of catchment approach, we do have a very strong focus on the estuary itself. And clearly the subcatchments that are closest to the estuary, like the Lansdowne, for example, are going to have a bigger impact than rivers like, say, the Barrington or Bowman, which have got plenty of land to attenuate those pollutants as they come down through the system. In terms of the consequence layer, it's based on the hydrodynamic model, and as we've heard from Erin, this is predicting how long water will be retained in the Manning estuary. The Manning estuary, even though it is a river estuary, does have quite a long retention time. I meant to check that figure before I spoke with you, but I think it's in the order of maybe 30 days. So quite a long retention time compared to some other rivers, and that makes it more sensitive to pollutants. And you can see once you combine a mapping layer like nutrients with the hydrodynamic model, you start to see which subcatchment has the biggest impact on the estuary itself. The risk model was validated using two different methods. So the first method, the results were compared with water quality data that's collected by Mid-Coast Water from 2001 to 2019. This had actually a good level of validation, so the observed concentrations through the data were a pretty good fit with the model. Water quality data, we also did a ground truthing exercise. So we spent 6 weeks doing a rapid site assessment program right through the catchment. We went to 206 sites and we did a whole lot of, we filled out data forms during that exercise on things like in-stream condition, as well as land use, riparian vegetation, weeds and all sorts of things. And unfortunately, because of the really extended drought, which we were right in the middle of, the water really varied a lot, and we actually didn't get a high level of validation through that ground truthing exercise for the model. So this is the model itself, and I guess as Erin's been saying, with this report card, you can also see the whole risk report. This report's on the Our Manning River website, and there is a whole lot of information in there for people who are really interested in catchment management to have a look at. So what you can see here in the estuary health risk model, combining all those layers that I've just shown you, is that the highest risk to estuary health is surface runoff from the Lansdowne River and Cedar Party Creek. So how do we use this information? Well, the way that we approach catchment management is through an adaptive management cycle. So this is a continuous sort of improvement process where we start by improving our understanding, and as we've done with that risk model, we use that for our policy and planning, which we're doing now with the catchment management program that we're developing. And we then implement on-ground action. Now, there's a step between the model that I've shown you and the implementation, and that's, of course, field investigations. So before we, the model is really just predictive. We then need to get out on the ground. But as we've said, 8,500 square kilometres almost for the catchment. It's really valuable to show us, well, where should we be looking? Once those on-ground works are done, we have the continuous monitoring through the report card, and we are also developing a monitoring program for the CMP. And then we evaluate our results and go back into that research phase. So it's a continuous cycle that's helping us manage the catchment on evidence-based science. And these are the sort of management actions that we might take. So on the left, you've got Brian Royce, not in the Manning catchment. I've got this photo actually from Karua, but one of our team's projects, and he's fenced cattle out of a wetland, and that's going to really allow that wetland to perform its buffering role in filtering out nutrients and sediment before they reach the estuary. And you can also see on the right here a rock revetment, which is stabilising a bank of the Lansdowne River. So these are the sorts of works that are already ongoing in our catchments, but will be, planned. And I guess the CMP itself, or the Catchment Management Program, will become a platform to guide ongoing action. So that's it from me. Has anyone got any questions?
So we do have one question already from John. Why is the Manning clearance rate 30 days, which is well above average? Do you know, or what do you think causes that?
I might ask Will, if you might answer that, Will. You might have more idea than me.
Well, I guess that depends on where you're looking. So if you're looking down the bottom near the, Harrington or Farquhar, it's not that long. It's much shorter. But as you go further and further up the estuary, what happens in these estuaries is that water goes in, water goes out, but then the bit that's the next bit up, it just goes back and forth, and it doesn't actually get flushed out. So it takes a long time for that bit, say up above Taree, to actually go a little bit down each time. So it doesn't actually get swapped all out unless there's a big flow on. So places like up at Big Swamp or up to Lansdowne or up the top of the estuary above Taree just take longer to go until there's a bigger flow on.
Thanks, Will. That was a good explanation. I hope that's right for you, John.
Okay, so the next question, I'm not sure if this is in relation to what Louise was just talking about or report card, so I think we should both answer it, Louise. Are we measuring for any toxins and or heavy metals? So in terms of the report card, we do only use a couple of indicators because we're looking at overall ecological health of the waterway. So no, we're not looking for toxins or heavy metals when we do that monitoring. We have a very specific set of standards that we do use. But report card is definitely not the only monitoring that we do on the river. So Louise, did you want to cover a little bit about what you guys do?
Yeah, I did read as part of our research for the catchment management program that our water services team was involved in a study of pesticides in the upper catchment. It wasn't done by our water services team, and I actually can't remember who it was done by. It was, I think, part of a much bigger project, and it did find very low rates of pesticides, so they weren't considered a risk factor.
Okay, so next up we have Martin Sullivan going to join us. So Martin is a spatial ecologist. He's got more than 15 years experience in vegetation mapping, conservation and biodiversity assessment. He works at Ecological Australia, and Martin is a principal ecologist and the national technical lead for a team of more than 80 ecologists. That's a lot of people to manage, Martin.
Sorry, luckily it's just a technical role, so I don't have to do the day-to-day, but certainly an exciting role.
And it says that you're regularly engaged by local and state government as well as private industry to undertake vegetation mapping at landscape scale. His recent mapping works include post-fire assessment of the Gondwana rainforests of Australia, native plant communities of cooler tops, and the coastal wetland mapping of the Manning, Karua and Mile catchments. So I'll pass it over to Martin, and he's going to present for us next.
All right, okay. All right, so hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about some recent work we've done mapping coastal wetlands in the Manning Estuary. Just like to start off, I guess, with a question about what is a wetland. There's many different definitions of what wetlands are, but generally wetlands are areas of land which are temporarily, seasonally or permanently covered or saturated with generally slow-moving, fresh, brackish or saline water. Wetlands are obviously, to most people, characterised by the plants and animals which occur there that are adapted to the natural water cycle. And importantly, wetlands provide valuable services for the community and the environment by providing flora and fauna habitat, protecting and enhancing water quality, reducing erosion, flooding, and storing blue carbon. So our study area is the coastal area of the Manning River catchment. The estuarine portion of it, seen here in a sort of dark blue hatching. It includes the Manning River, its tributaries and the floodplain, up to the proximal tidal limit, which is kind of between Taree and Wingham. And as Louise mentioned before, the broader catchment obviously extends all the way westward up to the top of Barrington Tops. So the objectives of our project were to produce a fine scale, a high resolution wetland type map, and to accurately describe the wetland types present based on their physiognomy, which is the characteristic species and their structure, their landscape position, species richness, condition, disturbance and threats, and protection under various state and federal legislation. Accurately defining wetland types is essential in assisting catchment management through improving habitat condition, increasing connectivity by reducing fragmentation, improving water quality through greater natural filtration, and improving and maintaining fish habitat. Additions of wetland types to boost the adequacy and representativeness of public conservation system is quite important, and hopefully this work will help with wetland reconstruction and restoration projects. So the methods for our project, we reviewed a suite of existing maps for the study area. We're not the first and won't be the last to look at wetland and other vegetation in the catchment. There's a large amount of data which is publicly available through the Department of Planning, Environment, Industry, such as Bionet Atlas and the Vegetation Information System. We undertook an additional targeted survey. Following a gap analysis, we did 22 floristic plots, which are sort of a 20 metre by 20 metre plot where we record all species present, and over 280 rapid points. Those points include the photograph, dominant species, structure, condition, wetland types and threats. Importantly for this project, we used a boat for a significant portion of the work, because obviously having a boat in an estuarine environment allows you much greater access to wetland areas than possible on foot, and it allowed for identification of issues that you might not be able to see from the shore. We also used drones, just small consumer drones. You can see me flying one there. We took about 100 videos, 400 photographs across 13 separate flights. And these drones are obviously very useful for accessing terrain that you couldn't get to on foot, and they also provide a different perspective when you're undertaking mapping. So how do we actually do vegetation mapping? I guess I've got this image here as a bit of a concept for you to be able to understand, or at least visualise how we see things when we're undertaking our mapping. We utilise state-of-the-art technology and data, such as high-resolution imagery, surface and elevation models to produce high-quality mapping outputs. We have custom-built hardware that we have here, paired with special spatial software to undertake mapping in 3D. It's a much more advanced method than the old stereoscopy that was used prior to the invention of the sort of the 3D analysis that we've got here, which allows us to map it at a very high resolution. And by doing it in 3D, you're really seeing it. It's like hanging out of the side of a helicopter and looking down. You really see the landscape, you see the mountains sticking out of the ground, you see the wetlands, you see different structure in the vegetation, which really aids in undertaking mapping. Just as a bit of an example here, this is just a site in Crowdy Bay. So you can see that it's a relatively small area. These wetlands occur on coastal sandmass with impeded drainage, with very little topographic relief, generally less than 10 metres. So some of the wetlands, such as these dark brown patches, are sedgelands. They're quite obvious, but other wetlands, such as heath and shrublands, are not that obvious, just from aerial photography. So in terms of our process, we go out and undertake field-based surveys. So those pink dots are rapid sites or full floristic surveys. And we supplement those with drone imagery. So we fly a drone around, record video, take photos. And what that allows us to do, particularly with the drone imagery, is get a different perspective on the landscape. So this is a photo taken from that same location with an oblique view, which allows you to see, I guess, firstly, how flat the landscape is, but then it allows you to see different features such as shrublands within the sedgelands and forested wetlands and other forests in the landscape. So onto digital elevation models. I guess it allows us to look at specific locations to really tease apart those topographical features. So in this map, blue represents the low areas and red represents the high areas. So for the most part, those sedgelands that I was talking about earlier are shown in blue, quite clearly low, but it's not all of them. So there's a large sedgeland down in the right-hand side or southeast of this image here, which is perched. It's much higher than surrounding wetlands. So when we undertake this mapping, we modify the digital elevation model for particular areas to assist us with mapping. And the final mapping product looks like this. So it takes into account all these data. This particular area has 6 different wetland types that we mapped, and we map those boundaries in 3D using our customized hardware and software. And we use the visual cues, so like what are the different vegetation communities look like, as well as the hydrology cues through the elevation model. And then we describe those communities based on field data. I've got a little visual demonstration here of, I guess, to help you visualize what it is that we're doing in the landscape. So this is sort of a 3D flight. So I'll just exit out of this presentation and switch to this one. Share that again. Aaron, can you just confirm you can see that?
Yep, that's working.
Cool. All right, here we go. So as the camera's panning in here, you've got these large sedgelands in orange, which are surrounded by broadleaf paperbark forest, with the non-wetland vegetation in the hills. So you can see it's quite flat. The landscapes in this particular area is very flat. So in the flatter areas, obviously with impeded drainage, you have more of the wetland type. So let us pause there, maybe come back a little bit. In the center of the screen here, you have this pink, which is a freshwater reedland with phragmites, and also a freshwater lagoon. So you're talking about open water with floating macrophytes. I'll keep that going. So there's quite a lot of broadleaf paperbark in this particular area, which is shown in that dark blue, with swamp mahogany along the more estuarine creeks. And this is sort of panning back south, heading over Crowdy Bay, where in this part of the landscape, which has been subject to previous sand mining, you have sort of these linear wetlands running perpendicular to the beach, which are the old sort of dune swales. And the video here finishes on this large sedgeland to the south of Crowdy Bay. So the results of the work that we did, we mapped 13 different wetland types, totaling nearly 9,000 hectares of wetlands, and we had a number of variants within each of those, which resulted in 51 unique mapping units. The main types that we mapped were, in terms of sheer abundance, swamp oak forest was the most abundant, followed by broadleaf paperbark, sedgelands, wet heath, grey mangrove and salt marsh, which often occur in a sort of a patchy mosaic in the landscape, and then swamp mahogany swamp forest. Importantly, 86% of all the wetlands that we mapped are currently protected under state or federal law. 4 of them are threatened ecological communities under the Biodiversity Conservation Act. 2 are also federally listed under the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. Salt marsh, which is also a threatened community, and mangrove are actually protected as well under the Fisheries Management Act, as they provide important breeding and foraging habitat for a variety of marine species. And the remainder of the non-protected vegetation is actually protected within Grady Bay National Park. So the sedge lands and wet heath are not actually protected as a threatened ecological community. So this is an overview, I guess, of our wetland type mapping. The final mapping was produced over 7 maps at a 1 to 60,000 scale. So that scale for each of these map sheets, sort of 18 kilometres on the diagonal. And the spatial data has obviously been provided to council, which is at a much higher resolution, so you can interrogate it, at the site or the property scale. I guess some of the positive news from the wetlands that we assessed, the majority, nearly 70%, were considered in good or excellent condition with limited disturbance. 19% of those were in fair condition, which is a moderate level of disturbance, which might include weeds, historical clearing, and surrounding intensive land use. And 12% were considered to be in poor or very poor condition with high levels of disturbance, including weed invasion, small patch sizes, and intensive land use. So a range of disturbances were observed during this study, including extensive floodplain clearing and drainage works, bank stability and erosion, which are particularly evident in areas that are subject to ongoing boat wake, which is relevant to the photo that Louise had up earlier. Former sand mining, as I mentioned, in Grady Bay National Park has affected the current sort of distribution and condition of wetlands. Fire, obviously fire is a natural process, but the fires that were experienced last year are well above that. The work that we did in Grady Bay at the time was prior to these fires. It was very dry. None of the sedge lands, which would usually be almost permanently wet, you could walk all the way through them. Some of the more permanent freshwater lagoons at Harrington were completely full, which was good, but obviously a fire pushed through and burnt parts of that national park not once but twice. Drought, obviously most of the wetlands, as I said, were dry at the time. Weed and pest invasion, I guess, is part of that good news, is that most of these wetlands are in relatively good condition, but there are some areas that need targeted weed and pest control. And dieback, including suspected myrtle rust, particularly in broadleaf paperbark forest, was observed. So to support the mapping, every wetland type that we've mapped comes with a profile that you can see here. It includes the vegetation class and formation, the name of the community, obviously, whether it's protected under various pieces of legislation, how much was mapped, like a layman's description of the community, as well as characteristic species and other information to help people understand the various components of each wetland type. So I guess some of the key management considerations and recommendations that came out of the work that we did. Prioritising wetland conservation and active management is important to improve condition. Need to consider whether local planning controls are suitable to minimise future development impacts in areas surrounding wetlands or in wetland catchments, and revising wetland boundaries in the coastal set, which I've got a slide on in a minute. I guess with consideration of climate change, understanding where wetlands currently occur and where they could potentially go in the face of changing sea levels, when you have things like mangroves which grow on the estuarine edge of the environment, and salt marsh which grows on mud flats. Obviously there's all this existing vegetation that sits behind those. Where are they going to go in the face of changing sea levels? There's obviously potential research opportunities into looking at dieback into key species, as I mentioned, broadleaf paperbark, and really I'm trying to understand some of the groundwater dependence of these wetlands. I think the general acceptance is that all wetlands have a proportional or are completely dependent on groundwater as part of their life cycle, and really understanding for some of those perched wetlands in the catchment how reliant they might be on groundwater. There's potential, I guess, to nominate some of the non-threatened communities as threatened communities, potentially, and preparing and implementing wetland conservation strategy for the catchment. So if we look at this map, demonstrates the current 2019 coastal set wetland in the blue hatching, and the extent of our wetland type mapping is in the green. So as you can see there, while on the whole, the coastal set mapping includes a lot of our wetlands, there's still about 30% of wetlands which aren't included within that area. And I'll just finish with a few pictures, some slides of what some of these different wetland types look like. So we've got freshwater wetlands, which are sort of coastal lagoons. Most of them that we mapped are naturally occurring, but you do get these wetlands occurring as a result of farm dams that are in good condition, etc. You got broadleaf paperbark, which is a really common wetland type. This one has a very strong sort of 2 metre tall sedge component. But as you can see with the paperbark here, it doesn't actually have a lot of leaves on it. It's lost a lot of its foliage as a result of dieback. The wet heaths, if you haven't had a chance to go and look at the wet heaths in Crowdy Bay, I'd strongly recommend it. They're some of the most beautiful heathlands to look at this time of year when they're in flower. There's different types of wet heath too. This wet heath's dominated by swamp banksia and some acacias and other things. So there's quite a variety of species that occur within these wetland types. The typical sort of grey mangrove and salt marsh complex that occurs in the estuarine environment there. Sedgeland, so this sedgeland in Crowdy Bay had a pretty new growth of banksia coming up in it, which I imagine is more of a sort of transitional thing based on the drier conditions that were being experienced. Swamp mahogany forest, which most of you would be familiar with, is sort of key habitat for koalas, regent honeyeaters, a range of other sort of birds and plants and animals. And then finally, just sort of with the reedland and swamp oak forest in the background. So yeah, that's it for me. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. If you've got any questions, I'd love to help answer them for you.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions here. The first one being mudflats and sandflats, while not vegetated wetlands, could be useful to know their extent as they're important habitats for shorebirds and other species. Is something that you would think about looking into?
Yeah, so I guess we didn't map mudflats per se because they weren't vegetated, but I think a lot of those would be included in the salt marsh mosaic. So if they were very large areas, they would have been excluded. Obviously, those areas are very important for migratory birds, curlews and the like. Certainly something that could be thought about in the future. I know the state government has important shorebird habitat mapping that's available for people to interrogate, but certainly something we could have a look into more in the future.
Excellent, thank you. There's another question here. Are any of the wetlands in this area identified as being wallum?
So some of the wet heath types are wallum. I guess wallum is a broad name that's all different sorts of names that people use for vegetation. Wallum's a community that's like a heathland community dominated by a particular banksia. So we definitely have wallum banksia and vegetation that you'd assign as wallum, particularly in Crowdy Bay. Whether it's actually a wetland, some of it is, some of it isn't. But there's a bunch of studies that other people have done in the region that kind of suggest that wallum itself is groundwater dependent. So I guess that's kind of one of the things in talking about understanding the groundwater dependence of different wetland types is important, because things that might be, I guess, outside of an area that you might think is a wetland, it might actually be drawing, all of its water source from groundwater, and it might be a bit difficult to see that just from walking around, driving around, or even from the air.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great presentation. Seeing that flyover mapping too is really interesting and really shows you the range that we have in this area and the different types. I guess when you're just sort of out for a drive on a Sunday or something, you don't really pick that up, and it's interesting to see how it's all mapped and how it's all a bit different in different areas. So that's really important. And actually, there was one other question over in the chat about the swamp oak forest and endangered ecological communities. want to talk about the EUC that's in this area?
Yeah, so I guess Swamp Oak Forest is listed as a threatened ecological community. So basically under the Biodiversity Conservation Act at a state level, all native vegetation remaining on coastal floodplains is a threatened community, and whether it's swamp oak forest, swamp sclerophyll forest, which is kind of the swamp mahogany, broadleaf paperbark, or freshwater wetlands, or salt marsh, they're all collectively threatened and listed. But there is a federal listing under the EPBC Act for swamp oak forest as well, so it has that 2 layers of protection. Under the Federal Act, I believe there's sort of stricter criteria for what actually might be considered a threatened community based on condition and patch size, because as you're probably aware, swamp oak is one of those species that if you have a wet paddock and it has some seed in it, it will regenerate freely. Like we often find swamp oak growing in places where it wouldn't naturally occur. So I guess there's the whole question about whether is it a community that you have at a particular site. Certainly some of the swamp oak forest that we went into is like magnificent remnant forest that had never been cleared, really diverse, but it can be sort of a really simplified community that like colonizes after disturbance.
So Will is an associate professor Associate Professor Will Glaymore is a principal research fellow at the Water Research Laboratory School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. Will is a Churchill Fellow, member of the Marine Estate Expert Knowledge Panel, chair of the Tuggerah Lake Expert Panel, and chair of the World Association for Waterborne Transport. Will also leads the Eco-Engineering Research Group and has been researching intertidal environments for more than 20 years. And he's going to have a bit of a chat to us about the work that's being done in the Manning area.
Okay, so yes, thanks everyone for hanging around on a Wednesday night at 6:30. So I will try to keep my storyline interesting and fill you with photos to think about how we manage things. So this is a story about where, when, and how we should do restoration in the Manning, particularly on these intertidal wetlands that Mark was just talking about. But it's a story that includes many, many people, and I'm just the front man for it. So I wanted to make sure that everyone, including council and LLS staff, who've all been involved, get the credit they deserve. The takeaway really is we had these environments that were pristine and beautiful and full of marine life and really everything that we desired them to be now. But then we went through and we drained them. And we put in thousands of kilometers of drain lines. And now what we're saying is some of that just hasn't worked out well. And the high priority sites we should be fixing. And I have a large group of researchers that work with me, and that's what we do for a living. So we go around and find these places, work out how we're going to fix them. And then as environmental engineers, we actually undertake that process to design and do it. But the big question is, where should we restore? We don't have endless amount of money. When should we restore it? And how should we go about doing that? And maybe even why? Why should we do it in the first place? So just a little background on the Manning. We've seen a few other things. If you look at a elevation map of the Manning, you can see that everything in blue here, it's a little bit blurred out there, but everything blue is nearly at sea level or below. So huge amounts of the lower estuary are really already at low-lying elevations, and you can envision that when we didn't have all these levees and flood mitigation structures in, that they would have been really wet and probably hold a fair bit of water through the system and been productive wetlands. What's happened is we've taken that landscape and drained it. So all the yellow lines are flood mitigation drains or floodplain drainage schemes that were put in to try to, as soon as a drop of water hit the landscape, get it off. We want to get as much water off the paddock as fast as we can, and we spent a long amount of time trying to maximize that drainage capacity. So it's been a huge change to the system in a relatively short period. And it was done in a very systematic way. So people laid out the landscape, and here on the picture on the left is Oxy Island, They let out the landscape, put grids over the top of it, and said, we're going to dig ditches wherever we can, and we're going to formalize and structure these so that they all work as efficiently as possible. And there were federal funded schemes that paid for this. And they go right back to the beginning of European settlement, and then was really had an injection of funds throughout the 60s and 70s after the 50 floods. So it was done on a big scale in a really concerted way, using large machinery, dynamites. This is a picture of them dynamiting a creek system so they could open up one section to another. You know, thousands of people were employed, lots of large machinery, and we went in and drained the landscape. And we see that everywhere now. You know, if you drive from Cairns down to Melbourne, you can see these large floodplain landscapes that are just filled with drains. But only, you know, less than 100 years ago, they didn't look like that. They simply had a lot more water on them, and that water stayed there for a longer time. And all that vegetation that Martin was talking about was a lot more prolific. And the problem is that draining them has caused many, many issues. And so Martin was talking about the lack of vegetation, or the health of the remaining vegetation. And usually what's left is the land that we didn't think we could turn into a farm. So it's the land that we couldn't actually get a drain in, or we thought if we get a drain in, that soil wasn't good enough for the farming anyway. And so everything else has been drained. And that has created big problems with acid sulfate soils to begin with. And, you know, we see, this is a picture on the top left of the big swamp area where, you know, acid sulfate soils, this is the cover of the acid sulfate soil manual and tells us exactly what we shouldn't be doing. So by draining the landscape, we've oxidized the sulfur in the land, the naturally occurring sulfur, and that's created acid. Some of the worst acid conditions in the country exist in the Manning. And every time it rains, there's water in the landscape that gets pushed off the land, or from the groundwater into the drains, and then from the drains into the creeks. And we've seen, you know, a really big decline in oyster production. We've seen lots of fish kills, and it's not just the Manning. There's 5 million hectares of this up and down the coast of Australia. And this is a story that I was involved in back in 2013, and there's other stories from the 70s and 80s, and only last month that really highlight the same issues going on for a long time. And it causes big issues. So this is a picture of the water on Cat-Eye Creek, and it's not an unusual occurrence. But the water shouldn't have clouds of aluminium and iron running through it. We shouldn't have large plumes of iron running off into the oyster leases. And we realize now that we can fix that. So I did my PhD in how do we restore this back in the late 90s. And ever since then, we've been working towards larger and better solutions to actually fix up the landscape and come up with solutions that can be implemented on big scale. And you need to think in big scale, because if you look at the Lower Manning, you know, acid sulfate soils is everywhere. So the maps done in the late 90s really just said what's the high probability of acid sulfate soils and the low probability. And this was as much detail as we had. So we knew that nearly the entire Lower Manning was filled with a high probability of acid sulfate soils. And so where do you start? How do you pick which areas are going to give you the best bang for your buck to fix? And really, what do you do once you figure that out? So there's a big problem, needs a big solution, but we can't fix everything at once. So how do we move forward bit by bit? So this is the question that I have been wrestling with for a couple of decades now. Where should be restored? How should it be restored? Why should it be restored? And ideally, when is the best time to restore it? So which bit of the land should we pull away and actually turn back into tidal wetlands for the best benefit to everyone? So we've come up with a process that goes around and looks at the landscape and tries to understand, of all the land that you've got, which bit you should target first. So what it does is it looks at the amount of water that flows into the site. Even if it's clean water, we want to pick it up because that water then quickly becomes acidic. How much drainage is across the site, because the more drainage there is, in simple terms, the more acid we're going to be taking from the ground into the creek water. What sort of structures are there that go between the landscape, the farmland, and the creek line? So there's floodgates or culverts or weirs, and how are they impacting water? How acidic is the landscape? What level is the acid? And how well does it flow through the landscape? Because it's not just about how low the pH is, it's how well it actually moves in the soil. And then how far is that particular paddock away from something that we really prize? So something that we think is a sensitive receiver, and Martin's data is part of that. So how far are we from an oyster reef or some sort of salt marsh or mangroves that we particularly want to make sure that it won't be impacted? Because once the water gets into the creek, it'll eventually make its way down there. And then, of course, how much flushing does the ocean provide? So this was brought up before. How much back and forth and interplay or interchange from the ocean do we get? Because if you're right at the mouth of the estuary, you're going to have a lot of dilution and a lot of buffering. But if you're way up the back, up Catart Creek, you're going to have very little. And then finally, and probably most importantly, how does the landholder want to manage their land moving forward? Most of this land we're talking about is currently under farming practice. It tends to be the most marginal of land. It tends to be the land that has the lowest return because it is the lowest land that has the highest acid. But we need to be able to work with the landholder to try to come up with a solution that's beneficial to everybody. And so we've got this mix. So what I was just saying is then put into this map and says, the highest areas, the highest concerns are areas with lots of drainage, lots of water flow, lots of acid. The acid moves quickly. The acid's near the surface, and it's near something that's going to get impacted quickly. And so we've gone through this process in the Manning. In fact, now we've gone through it in most of the large floodplains in New South Wales. And we've, through really detailed analysis of the field site, so getting onto the paddocks and taking measurements for months at a time, we've been able to develop up what are the highest priorities. And so here's a map for the Manning of what the highest priorities are. And it's the Moto, Guinea, and Big Swamp areas. They're the biggest exporters of acid that are having the biggest impact in our estuary. And then once we've worked out where the biggest ones are, we then zoom into those sites and we look at within those sites, how we're going to fix them. And I've just put the pictures up on the right of people who've been involved in doing all that field work and helping make these maps. And so here's zoomed in those two areas that I put circles on before, because what we see is that within those highest priority areas, there are highest priority areas. And what's been important for us in doing this work is we find that 80% of the problem is coming from 20% of the areas. And in the Manning, it's even more intense than that. So if we can then target those really high priority areas, we can then say that's where the council should, or the state government should spend their money. It's justifiable to spend that because that's where you get the biggest return in water quality. And also then that's where we shouldn't spend other money. So it's saying, spend money in the high priority areas and don't waste spending your money on the low priority areas that aren't going to get you a return. Historically, I've been doing this for a long time now. Historically, what we were doing is working with the nicest landholders who were most willing to work with us and who were most willing to put their hand up. But what we found is in many cases, those landholders are the ones who are actually already doing all of the hard yard. They're already managing their paddocks really well. So we've been trying to target these areas and working with Mid-Coast Council to say, these are the areas you should look at, and then coming up within those highest areas, what should be done on those paddocks. So we've zoomed right into that area, and this area here is a good example where the big swamp region has been attacked, and we have tried to, as best as possible, fix up the worst case areas. So I'll give you some examples of that. On this site, we, working with council and local land services and fisheries, went through the process of saying, within the high priorities, there are the highest priorities, and we're then going to target those areas. And that was a big project. So the council ended up purchasing or acquiring, now it's probably nearly up to 1,000 hectares of land in this region. And working with them, we designed a new landscape for the area that would get the best return for the actual restoration project and would ensure the minimal amount of maintenance moving forward. Because obviously we want the site to work really well, but rarely do we have the funds to keep working on it and building it. So you've got to build the best site you can with the most upfront money you can acquire. So on this site, we actually designed a new river channel to encourage the tidal waters to get into the area. And because that's most important, because we knew that the tidal waters are going to buffer the acid. So we built a whole new river channel. And we also filled in many kilometers of the drain lines that are there. So this picture on the left is a drain line that was kilometers long, where we filled it in, used the old material that was there to fill in that levee, fill in that channel, recreate the old natural flow paths that were there. And then the picture on the right is an example of the new river channel we made through the system. And I'll just give you some before and afters of this site, and it's worthwhile going out and visiting it if you get the opportunity. So this is taken from the hill looking down towards Crowdy, and this is before the site. So the pH on that site, it doesn't look so bad right now, but the pH on there is typically about 2.7, maybe 3. It's really highly acidic. The iron and the aluminium are up to toxic levels, so over 100 milligrams a liter. Before it looked like this, afterwards it looked like this. So we built a whole new drain line through here, which allowed the farmer who was still running this land to have good drainage through there. In the process of doing that, we created a new levee bund that bunds off this whole area out through here, about 1,000 hectares. And then the river channel that we built runs all the way back up through here. And that is encouraging the tidal water to get up in through here and wet this whole area, but also neutralize the acid using bicarbonates. Here's another picture of the site before and after. So we have a camera up on a pole that takes photos every day. And this is the large acid skull that was there. It was, well, nothing would grow on it. You know, it was completely acidic, a hard pan, and full of arsenic and heavy metals. And then we went from that to a few years later, relatively quickly. This is less than 5 years later. You know, we've got organic material growing on it. We've got plants establishing, and we've got water inundating it and neutralizing the acid. Another angle is taken from, this is from a GPS drone that goes to the same spot, takes a photo before and after. So that's an image showing the extent of the new creek line or river line that we built and how we let the tide into there. So that's during a high tide image and showing how the water can get up across the site. So, and we're talking about a lot of water. 1,000 hectares covers a big area. And here's some examples of before, during the construction, while we're actually building it, working on it, and then after, during low tide, and after during high tide. And these are a little bit old. We're still getting photos in. The site has really evolved now to where we're getting really strong salt marsh and mangrove growth across it, and hopefully fixing up a lot of the water quality. The site was awarded a Green Globe Award, which is a big deal for us. And that was between recognizing the efforts of council, so people like Dave Hopper and Bob McDonald and Tanya, who have really taken the risk on a project of this size and been paid off, I think at least, in what we've achieved. The next question is, though, and we get this all the time, is why? Why would you spend the money to do a project like this? You know, a lot of people would see the the environmental benefit, but why else would you do it? And I guess our experience now has been taking the knowledge that we can do it and then going through what we call cost benefit analysis of showing that the economic returns from doing so. So we've done a full cost benefit analysis on this site and on acquisition of other sites in the region and which ones would be the best, and purely just based on return on that land without looking at the environmental returns or the carbon returns, but purely just the productivity returns from restoring that land. We get a 7-to-1 net positive ratio. And that's assuming we have no benefit from the site at all for the first 5 years. So there's no return at all. We just said, let it take 5 years to restore and then calculate the benefits as we know that have been done. And that project is available, and I encourage, if you're interested, to have a read of that, led by Alice Harrison. So we've been working on this economic returns as well as the engineering. And then now we've, working with Council and LLS, have Brad Henderson doing his PhD on zooming out from that site and that area to the entire Manning Estuary and saying, all right, well, we have an understanding of how water moves through the estuary. What is the hydrodynamics of it? We have an understanding of where salt marsh and mangroves exist and mud flats and sand flats exist based on the hydrodynamics. And so how much they get wet and how often they get wet and how deep they get wet. Then we want to predict where we think these landscapes, these ecosystems will exist into the future. So Brad's doing his PhD on first looking at where we think everything will exist. Because we have these huge areas like Moto and Guinea and Kupanuk and the list goes on and on. Pelican area, Pelican Bay, that are all going to be really challenging to farm in the future. A really small amount of sea level rise is going to make it difficult to keep farming that land because it just won't drain. You know, without the drainage capacity, because the tide's rising and it's below sea level, it won't drain. So at some point, the land use won't be as productive as it is. And the productivity we get from other options is going to increase. So Brad's looking at what those options would be, and in his PhD, then looking at, depending on what's changing and how fast it's changing and where it's changing, when these things should be undertaken, and having some sense of, on an economic argument, what is the best time and location to be doing. And so that all comes together to have a whole plan for the Manning that says, this is what we think would exist, this is where we think it would exist, and this is the management regime that we would recommend you doing. Hopefully that gets picked up by council and others that would then drive the communication and the engagement and the acquisitions and the working with the locals to get the best movement forward. So it's all about this idea of valuing the ecosystem services and the things that are provided. The buzzword right now is called nature-based solutions. So trying to reduce flooding by having, wetlands there or mangroves there, and versus having levees there. By sequestering carbon in these landscapes, which we know does a better job of holding carbon than pretty much any other ecosystem in the world, and quantifying those benefits and then explaining why we should do that versus having big acid skulls as the alternative. So Brad's work is going to be looking at this and how sea level rise will be impacting and changing with time. If you look at these bottom pictures here, you very quickly can see the extent that water levels at 2 meters AHD, which is what we'd have by 2100 virtually, will do for inundation of the whole lower Manning. I mean, it is quite astonishing what's going to be wet most of the time. And so we're really thinking through this process and trying to plan forward so we end up with a better outcome. And then I should just mention that all this work is being supported by monitoring. There's been a range of, at least on the Big Swamp site, about 5 years worth, or 6 or 7 now, of how the site is evolving with time, from water quality, photo points, drone surveys. There's been ongoing fish surveys and vegetation changes with time. And we're learning a lot from this that we're then applying not just here, but across the whole country. And here's an example of the site. So this was the Big Swamp site immediately after it had been restored. And you can see as we're moving forward, the vegetation, this was only a few months ago, is really coming in strong. We're getting great mangrove and salt marsh vegetation coming through, and the whole site is just brimming. So that's really my story to where, when, how, why we should be doing this, and trying to get that combination that would really tell an easy story for anyone that says why you should invest in this sort of work in the next 50 years. And then I just need to finish again with pointing out that I'm really just telling the story of what many people have been doing, both council, LLS, and staff working with me at the university. So that's all from me.
Okay, perfect. So if you've got any questions for Will, pop them down the bottom here. So the first question that we have for you, Will, what proportion of acid runoff is generated from natural landscapes rather than drained acid sulfate soil areas?
Well, I assume John wants a very specific answer. I would suggest that in the Manning system, we don't really have natural landscapes in the estuary. Well, very few natural landscapes in the estuary. And so in terms of a total acidity discharge, the acid sulfate area would be much, much bigger. If I had to put a number out there, it'd be 90% of what's coming out. The pH and the metals are just ridiculously high and through the roof. And then also the drainage lines are taking that acid and discharging it into the estuary. Where in natural landscapes, when they're flat and you don't have drain lines, there's no reason why the acid would be moving from where it's produced into the creek.
And Gillian's asked, you've talked about prioritising land areas with respect to water quality and cost effectiveness. Should we also be prioritising areas for greatest carbon capture?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we are doing that. So I've got a number of projects working with the Blue Carbon Lab guys in Deakin, where we are trying to have the right mosaic, where you're saying it's not just for acid, it's also for carbon, it's also for birds, it's also for vegetation, it's also for getting limiting mosquitoes and and everything. We want to get the most value we can. But what we know is that anytime we create a tidal wetland system, we are inherently creating the best carbon capture system that nature has invented. And that's largely because these salty systems don't have methane release. And so since they don't have methane release, unlike freshwater systems, they have a significantly greater carbon storage capacity. And I've actually got a couple of postdocs who do this full time, and we're really trying to get some numbers down. The challenge is there is no carbon market yet. So you can come with all numbers in the world, but I am working on that one. There's a emission reduction fund system, and we're trying to actually get the actual carbon into, or salt marsh and mangroves into tidal wetlands into the emission reduction fund.
Awesome, thank you. There was just one other question, but Martin, I think this was actually for you during your presentation. Is it true that mangrove forests are a unique ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I guess mangroves occur in that intertidal area that Will was just talking about. They occur on sort of estuarine muds we've got 2 mangrove species. I think there might even be a third in the catchment that I didn't manage to get a look at, but you've got grey mangrove and river mangrove, which occurs further upstream. So it's kind of at the tidal reaches of the estuary. And they're really the interface between the estuary and other environments. So they occur on a different type of soil to what the other communities do, and they're subject to much frequent inundation. So they're definitely a unique system.
Excellent. Well, we're reaching our closing time very rapidly, so I just want to say thank you to Martin, Will and Louise for joining us this evening. The Manning is such an interesting system. It is unique. It's so different to some other systems and such an important part of the Mid-Coast area. So it's great to see so much research being undertaken. We have so many different research and scientific monitoring programs happening, and with the new catchment management program, we're really working hard to make sure that we're protecting the Manning into the future. So thank you all for presenting. I would like to say thank you to everybody who attended. I know it's a lot to attend on a Wednesday evening and give up your time. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much for attending.